Something big is shifting behind the scenes in the NFL right now, and most fans haven't connected the dots yet. On the surface, it looks like another offseason rumor, a quarterback name floating around, a front office giving vague answers, a coach saying all the right things without actually committing to anything. But when you slow it down and really look at what's happening, the picture starts to feel off. Because this isn't just about a quarterback battle. It's about loyalty, power, and a coach who may be trying to rewrite his own history. Reports have quietly started circulating that one team isn't fully sold on its future under center. Recovery concerns, long-term uncertainty, and a growing sense that the current plan might not be as locked in as fans were led to believe. That hesitation alone would normally be forgettable, but then a very specific name entered the conversation. A quarterback tied to controversy, to frustration, to a previous regime that didn't end cleanly. And suddenly, this stopped being random. Because the coach now in charge of that team just happens to be the same coach who once fought to bring that quarterback into the league. The same coach who believed in him when others questioned it. The same coach critics say never let go of his guy. That's where this story takes a turn. At the same time, the quarterback's current team is doing something that doesn't look accidental at all. Coaches connected to the old era are disappearing. New voices are arriving. Entire philosophies are being replaced. And no one is saying it out loud, but the direction is obvious. This organization is choosing a future, which raises a dangerous question. What happens to the players tied to the past? Fans are arguing online. Rumors are spreading fast. Some say this is a smart reunion waiting to happen. Others believe it's the start of another disaster. And buried underneath all of it is a young quarterback whose career could swing in a completely different direction depending on one decision. This isn't just a trade rumor. It's a collision between belief and change. And once you see how all these pieces line up, it becomes clear why what happens next won't just affect one team. It could reshape two franchises overnight. Because the next move, that's the one nobody will stop talking about. A few months ago, Dillon Gabriel's name barely registered outside of Cleveland. He wasn't dominating headlines. He wasn't being hyped as the future. He was simply there, part of the room, part of the depth chart, part of a plan that never felt fully defined. And that's exactly why his sudden rise in trade chatter feels so strange. When the Browns drafted Gabriel, it wasn't viewed as a flashy move. Reports at the time claimed the pick came with strong internal backing, but publicly, expectations stayed low. Developmental upside, system fit, a quarterback who could manage the game if needed. Nothing about the narrative suggested urgency. But once the season unfolded, cracks started showing. Gabriel got opportunities, real ones, starts that mattered. And while he avoided major mistakes, the offense often stalled when it mattered most. Late downs became predictable, drives fizzled out, and when the pressure was highest, the aggression just wasn't there. That's when fans started noticing something else. On the same roster was another young quarterback playing with a completely different mindset. Faster decisions, more confidence, a willingness to take risks, even if it meant failing loudly. And slowly, the conversation shifted from patience to comparison. This is where things get uncomfortable. Because quarterbacks don't just compete with opponents, they compete with perception. And once the idea takes hold that you're playing not to lose instead of playing to win, it's incredibly hard to shake. Still, none of that alone explains why Gabriel's name is suddenly being floated as a trade target. The real reason goes deeper. His situation was never just about performance. It was about alignment, about who believed in him, who protected him, and who was willing to stand behind him when things got messy. And when that support system disappeared, so did his security. That's why his future feels so unstable right now. And that's why teams around the league are suddenly paying attention. Because when a quarterback tied to the old regime becomes expendable, someone else always comes calling. And in this case, the call might be coming from the last place anyone expected. Here, where this story stops being about a quarterback and starts being about a coach. Because Dillon Gabriel's name didn't randomly surface in trade rumors. It surfaced because one person never truly moved on from him: Kevin Stefanski. Reports over the last year have suggested that Stefanski was one of Gabriel's strongest internal supporters from day one. It's been said he pushed hard for him during the draft process and believed the system would eventually bring out his best traits. Even when the results didn't fully match the expectations, that belief never really faded. And now Stefanski is in a new building. New city, new front office, new opportunity to do things his way again. But old habits have a way of following coaches around the league. And one of Stefanski's most consistent traits has always been trust in familiarity. Players he knows, players he's comfortable with, players he believes were misunderstood the first time around. That's why rumors started spreading so quickly once his name became attached to Atlanta's decision-making. The Falcons aren't exactly stable at quarterback. Recovery questions, long-term confidence issues, a front office trying to balance patience with pressure to win. In that environment, a familiar quarterback suddenly becomes appealing, especially one who already knows the playbook, the terminology, and the expectations. But that's also where the controversy explodes. Because to many fans, this wouldn't look like a fresh start. It would look like an ego play, a coach trying to prove he was right instead of admitting the situation didn't work. And history hasn't been kind to those kinds of decisions. Online reaction has already been harsh, fans questioning the logic, others warning that this is how dysfunction creeps back in, and some openly saying they'd rather ride with uncertainty than relive another team's frustration. Still, belief can be powerful. And if Stefanski truly thinks Gabriel was failed by circumstance, not ability, then this reunion might feel inevitable to him, which creates a dangerous standoff. Because while Atlanta debates whether familiarity is worth the risk, Cleveland is doing something far more decisive. They're moving on. And the speed at which they're doing it tells us exactly how serious they are about the future they've chosen. If there was ever any doubt about where Cleveland is headed, it's gone now. Since the regime change, the Browns haven't tiptoed around decisions. They've been direct, calculated, and ruthless in a way that tells you this isn't about easing transitions or protecting feelings. This is about control and clarity. One of the biggest signs came from the coaching staff overhaul. Positions that were ignored for years are suddenly being prioritized. New offensive voices are stepping in. Entire responsibilities are being redefined. And perhaps most telling of all, the organization has started distancing itself from anything tied to the previous era without making a public spectacle of it. That silence speaks volumes. Because when teams truly believe in competition, they say it. When they want to let things play out, they repeat it constantly. But Cleveland isn't doing that. There's no talk of open battles, no vague promises about patience, just action. And that's bad news for players connected to the old guard. In the NFL, when a new staff comes in, alignment matters more than talent. If you weren't drafted by them, developed by them, or envisioned in their system, your margin for error shrinks fast. Sometimes it disappears entirely. That's the position Dillon Gabriel finds himself in. Not because he suddenly became unusable, but because the team around him no longer reflects the vision he was brought into. The offense is being reshaped for a different style, a different tempo, a different mindset. And the more that vision becomes clear, the more obvious it is that Gabriel doesn't fit it. Meanwhile, the Browns aren't looking backward. They're investing in systems designed to unlock explosiveness. They're building around aggression rather than caution. and they're signaling without saying it outright that they're done splitting focus. Which brings us to the quarterback, who benefits the most from this shift. Because while one name is quietly being phased out, another is being positioned front and center. And once you see who this entire reset is really about, the rest of the story starts to make sense. At this point, it's impossible to ignore who Cleveland is shaping everything around. Every hire, every adjustment, every shift in philosophy points toward a quarterback who thrives on movement, confidence, and controlled chaos. Someone who doesn't freeze when the pocket collapses. Someone who looks for opportunity instead of safety. That description doesn't fit everyone in the room. It fits one name: Shedeur Sanders. When Sanders has been on the field with real support, the difference has been obvious. The offense doesn't stall, it stretches. Decisions are quicker. Reads are more aggressive. Even the mistakes look different. They come from trying to make something happen instead of trying not to mess up. And that matters more than people realize. Coaches can coach aggression. They struggle to coach hesitation. That's why the recent staff moves feel so intentional. A dedicated pass game focus doesn't happen unless the front office believes the quarterback can handle it. You don't bring in teachers unless you're confident the student has the ceiling to justify it. This isn't about managing a competition anymore. It's about committing. And that commitment quietly reshapes the entire quarterback room. Because once a staff decides who the offense is built for, everyone else becomes expendable, no matter how much experience they have or who drafted them. That's why there's been no strong push to defend Dillon Gabriel publicly. No long-term endorsements. No statements about patience. Just a steady silence while everything around him changes. In the NFL, that silence usually means decisions have already been made. And as Cleveland leans fully into its future, the question shifts elsewhere. If this move clears the runway for Sanders, then what happens to Gabriel? Because there's still one place where his name isn't fading. It's getting louder. And that place might be willing to take the risk Cleveland no longer wants. This is where the story stops being simple and starts getting messy. Because Atlanta isn't just weighing Dillon Gabriel as a quarterback. They're weighing what kind of organization they want to be right now. And that decision is happening under pressure. On paper, the Falcons should be stable. They've invested. They've preached patience. They've talked about long-term development. But behind closed doors, reports suggest there's hesitation. Not panic, but doubt. And in the NFL, doubt is often the first crack before a big move. That's why Gabriel's name keeps resurfacing. From a coach's perspective, the appeal is obvious. Familiarity shortens timelines. A quarterback who already knows the system reduces early mistakes. And for a staff that doesn't have the luxury of waiting years to prove itself, that matters. But here, the problem. Fans see the risk instantly. To them, this doesn't look like a smart hedge. It looks like a rewind, a move driven more by comfort than upside. And many are already calling it out for what they think it is, a coach protecting his own judgment instead of taking a clean swing at the future. That reaction matters. Because quarterbacks don't operate in a vacuum. They carry narratives. And if Gabriel walks into Atlanta with skepticism already boiling, every incompletion will feel heavier, every loss louder, every comparison unavoidable. Still, coaches don't always follow the noise. And if Stefanski truly believes Gabriel was never put in the right position to succeed, Atlanta becomes more than just an option. It becomes a proving ground. A chance to show that the first chapter didn't define the story. Which sets up a dangerous scenario. Because if Atlanta makes this move and it fails, the fallout won't stop at the quarterback position. It will raise questions about judgment, direction, and whether the franchise is building forward or circling old decisions. And that's why this moment feels so tense. Because Cleveland has already chosen clarity. Atlanta still has to decide whether familiarity is worth the gamble. And coming up next is the quiet detail that makes this entire situation feel less like speculation and more like something that's already in motion. There's one detail in all of this that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention, and once you notice it, the entire situation starts to feel a lot less hypothetical. Because while rumors swirl publicly, front offices communicate in patterns. And Cleveland's pattern has been unmistakable. They're not just changing coaches, they're changing priorities. Roles that once didn't exist suddenly do. Philosophies that were once tolerated are now gone. And most importantly, the organization has stopped speaking in what-ifs. There's no language about waiting to see how things develop. No talk of extended evaluation periods. No public effort to reassure players tied to the previous vision. Instead, decisions are being made quietly and quickly, the way teams act when they already know where they're headed. That's the signal. When a franchise believes it still needs answers, it stalls. When it believes it's found them, it accelerates. And Cleveland is accelerating. That urgency doesn't leave much room for passengers, especially at quarterback, especially for someone whose strongest advocate is no longer in the building. In situations like this, teams don't announce exits ahead of time. They let the market form. They let interest leak. And then they move when the timing feels right. Which is exactly what's happening now. That's why Gabriel's name didn't surface in a vacuum. It surfaced because Cleveland is letting the league know, without saying it outright, that conversations are welcome. And once that door cracks open, it rarely closes again. So while Atlanta debates risk and reward, Cleveland is already operating as if the outcome is inevitable. And that's what makes the next move so important. Because once a team decides it's done looking backward, anyone willing to reach into that past becomes part of the story, whether they're ready for it or not. And with one coach who never stopped believing, and one quarterback running out of time, this feels less like a rumor now, and more like the calm before a move that changes everything. This is the part people rarely talk about. For quarterbacks like Dillon Gabriel, opportunities don't reset every season. They narrow, quietly at first, then all at once. And right now, this might be the cleanest window he's going to get. Cleveland is moving on. That much is clear. And around the league, teams aren't exactly lining up to gamble on developmental quarterbacks tied to failed regimes. That's just reality. So when a head coach with real power, real influence, and real belief is willing to vouch for you again, that matters more than any stat line ever could. That's why this potential reunion feels so urgent. If Gabriel stays in Cleveland, he risks becoming an afterthought in an offense no longer designed for him. If he moves elsewhere without Stefanski, he likely walks into a depth role with no guarantees. But Atlanta, that's different. That's familiarity. That's trust. That's a coach willing to say, I know what you can be. Of course, that belief cuts both ways. Because if this move happens and it doesn't work, there's no hiding from it. Not for the quarterback, and definitely not for the coach. It would confirm every criticism that's followed Stefanski since Cleveland, that he leans too hard on comfort, that he struggles to let go, that he'd rather prove he was right than admit something failed. That's what makes this decision so heavy. It's not just a football move, it's a referendum. And while Atlanta weighs that risk, Cleveland has already crossed the bridge. They're not looking back. They're building fast, committing hard, and clearing the runway for a new leader under center. Which means the countdown has already started. And once this move becomes official, because all signs point to it heading that way, the debate won't be about why it happened. It'll be about who was right all along. This story was never just about Dillon Gabriel. It's about identity. Cleveland is choosing direction over nostalgia. They're betting on clarity, structure, and a quarterback who fits the vision they're building right now, not the one they inherited. Whether that gamble pays off or not, there's no confusion anymore. The future has a face. Atlanta, meanwhile, is standing at a fork in the road. One path leads forward, uncertain, uncomfortable but new. The other leads back to a familiar belief that never quite worked the first time. If the Falcons make this move, they're not just trading for a quarterback. They're buying into a philosophy, one that says environment matters more than results, that timing can change outcomes, that unfinished business deserves another shot. And sometimes that gamble works. Other times, it defines a franchise for all the wrong reasons. For Dillon Gabriel, this could be a lifeline. For Kevin Stefanski, it could be redemption or confirmation. And for both franchises, the fallout will linger long after the headlines fade. So when the move finally happens, or when it doesn't, remember this wasn't sudden. It was built quietly, piece by piece, until only one decision was left. And once that decision is made, there's no pretending it was ever just another off-season rumor.